Lieutenant General Courtney M. Hodges, commanding the U.S. First Army, peered over the sprawling maps on his desk, only to see disorder and panic spreading across the Ardennes forest. The German counterattack that began on the morning of December 16, 1944, had struck like a lightning bolt, overwhelming some American units and annihilating others entirely. While a handful of frontline forces dug in stubbornly, clinging to the last vestiges of defensive positions, other units simply vanished under the relentless pressure of the German advance. Hodges's mind raced as reports filtered in of German commandos operating behind his lines, disguised in American uniforms and spreading confusion, while mass surrenders were reported among exhausted and disoriented U.S. troops. One German formation in particular caused him grave concern. Kampfgruppe, the spearhead of the feared 1st SS Panzer Division, led by the ruthless SS Lieutenant Colonel Johann Paper. This armored juggernaut carved a path toward the crossroads city of Liège, a critical waypoint on the road to Antwerp and the Belgian coast, leaving a trail of destruction and terror in its wake. The situation turned from alarming to horrifying when rumors reached Hodges of a massacre at Bognes near Malmedy, where some 80 American soldiers had been gunned down after surrendering to Paper's forces on December 17. Desperate to halt this lethal advance, Hodges immediately sought reinforcements. First, he contacted the 9th Army, which promised the 30th Division, then refitting near Aachen, while he simultaneously appealed to Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower for the release of the Theater Reserve. Ike responded swiftly, dispatching the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions from camps in France to reinforce the Ardennes. Time, however, was a scarce commodity. To slow Paper's momentum, small pockets of combat engineers, anti-tank gunners, and infantry staged heroic delaying actions, blowing bridges, erecting roadblocks, and engaging in direct fire with anti-aircraft guns, including massive 90mm cannons aimed straight at advancing German armor. First Army's staff employed Piper Cub spotter planes to shadow Paper's forces along the Amblev River Valley, tracking their movement through villages such as Ligneville, Stavelot, and La Glise. By midday on December 18th, the enemy was perilously close, only 12 road miles from First Army headquarters at the resort town of Spa, Belgium. Hodges rushed his available forces, including the 30th Infantry and 82nd Airborne Divisions, into blocking positions along the valley, but stopping Paper's armored assault required tanks of his own, and the only unit he could find ready for action was the 740th Tank Battalion, codenamed Daredevil. Yet the Daredevils had a critical problem. They had no conventional tanks. Formed in March 1943 at Fort Knox, Kentucky, the 740th had been designated a special unit, secretly equipped with a Canal Defense Light (CDL) tank, an M3A1 medium tank chassis fitted with a high-intensity carbon arc searchlight designed to illuminate the battlefield at night, temporarily blinding enemy defenders. The unit, kept under strict secrecy, was initially sent to Camp Baus, Arizona, in the desert training area for specialized training. Soldiers faced punishing conditions, scorching heat, gusting winds, and dust that penetrated engines, clothing, and food alike. With few actual CDLs available, men were relegated to menial labor, and morale sank, leading to the replacement of the original battalion commander after a failed inspection. The unit's fortunes changed on November 12, when Lieutenant Colonel George K. Rubel, a battle-hardened North Africa veteran from Phoenix, Arizona, assumed command. Rubel immediately transformed the 740th into a premier fighting force, focusing on mastering conventional M4 Sherman tanks when CDLs were unavailable. He drilled his crews relentlessly in vehicle handling, gunnery, and combined arms operations, ensuring every soldier was proficient with pistols, carbines, rifles, and Thompson submachine guns. Tanks became their homes, their lives intertwined with the machinery they would depend upon in combat. Through winter-long exercises, Rubel instilled a culture of excellence and ingenuity. The battalion built dummy minefields, infiltration courses, and even a mock city to practice urban engagements. Rubel led by example, running the most dangerous courses himself under live-fire conditions, insisting that tanks fight with open hatches to maintain maximum visibility and awareness. Everyone looked for targets, he later wrote, and if they didn't see the enemy first, they didn't live. His rigorous training and uncompromising standards paid off, producing a battalion that excelled in accuracy, teamwork and initiative, traits that would prove decisive in the Ardennes, as the 740th Tank Battalion, once a secretive gizmo unit, faced the might of Kampfgruppe paper head-on and helped blunt the Nazi offensive in one of World War II's most critical moments. When the 740th Tank Battalion departed Kampfhaus in April 1944, it had already developed a dual proficiency. It could execute conventional tank missions while remaining ready for the top-secret operations involving the Canal Defense Light, CDL tanks. By July, the battalion sailed to England, and 3 months later, the Daredevils made landfall at Utah Beach, poised to join the final push into Nazi-occupied Europe. Following a rapid drive across France, they linked up with the First Army in November 1944, only to receive news that dramatically altered their trajectory. Their specialized CDL mission had been cancelled. The 740th was to be reorganized as a standard medium tank battalion, refitted with M4 Sherman medium tanks and M5A1 Stuart light tanks. Unfortunately, First Army could provide only a handful of tanks, 9 Shermans and a few Stuarts, for familiarization, with a promise that a full complement would arrive, perhaps by January. Despite this limitation, Lieutenant Colonel George Rubel pressed on, continuing rigorous training and organizational work to keep his battalion combat ready. The situation turned dire on December 16, when Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's German forces launched their surprise Ardennes counteroffensive, later immortalized as the Battle of the Bulge. The 740th was garrisoned in the muddy Belgian village of Neuf-Cateau, some 50 miles behind the front lines. Within hours, the battalion was ordered to lend its 9 borrowed M4s to another unit, leaving Rubel with only 3 Stuarts and 2 scrounged assault guns. On December 17, Rubel visited First Army headquarters in Spa and discovered the alarming scale of the German breakthrough. He was warned that the battalion might have to operate as infantry, a role for which they were neither trained nor equipped. Returning to his command post, Rubel immediately ordered preparations for rapid deployment wherever they were needed, aware that the circumstances were bleak and the margin for error vanishingly thin. A glimmer of fortune arrived in the form of Colonel Nelson M. Lind, who was organizing the defense of Sprimont, a sprawling vehicle repair depot situated about a dozen miles west of Paper's advancing column. Lind reported that his depot had several operational tanks but no crews to man them. Remembering Rubel's battalion, First Army ordered the Daredevils to move to Sprimont at 12:45 p.m. on December 18, requisition all available armor, and prepare to defend the depot. 2 hours later, Captain James D. Barry, nicknamed Red for his vivid shock of hair, led Company C toward Sprimont, followed closely by Rubel, his command section, and as many mechanics as could be assembled. Time remained the most pressing enemy. Would they be able to ready themselves before Paper's attack? Upon arrival, the Daredevils were confronted by a sobering reality. Of the 25 armored vehicles at Sprimont, only 3 were on the ready line, and none were fully equipped. Most had been salvaged from damaged units and stripped of critical parts, including radios, weapons, and tools. Not a single tank carried a complete load of ammunition. Undeterred, Company C's tankers threw themselves into the grueling task of preparing the vehicles overnight. Old right-engine M4s sat beside newer models outfitted with British gear, while Staff Sergeant Charlie Loopy claimed an M36 tank destroyer and Sergeant John A. Thompson was assigned a duplex-drive amphibious Sherman, missing its 75mm breech block and all 3 machine guns. Captain Barry directed Thompson and his damned duck to the rear of the column, determined they would fight despite the deficiencies. In addition to these improvised assignments, some tankers had to ride M7 self-propelled howitzers or M8 assault guns, neither of which they had trained on. To further complicate matters, 2 M24 Chaffee light tanks, intended only as demonstration vehicles to familiarize troops with the newest models, were pressed into combat, forcing their crews to learn under fire. Despite the overwhelming challenges, the 740th embraced the situation, transforming a ragtag collection of ill-equipped vehicles and makeshift crews into a cohesive fighting force, poised to confront Kampfgruppe Paper and hold the line in one of the most desperate moments of the Ardennes campaign. As the men of the 740th Tank Battalion, the Daredevils worked through the freezing night to ready their salvaged and mismatched machines for combat. The front along the Amblev River was collapsing under the pressure of the German offensive. On December 18, 1944, Major General Leland S. Hobbs's 30th Old Hickory Infantry Division began hastily deploying along the northern shoulder of Kampfgruppier's brutal thrust. Colonel Edward M. Sutherland's 119th Infantry Regiment was tasked with blocking the SS Spearhead's westward advance, and to that end, he sent a reinforced battalion forward to occupy the small Belgian village of Stoumont, an otherwise quiet settlement now destined to become a battlefield. Through the cold, misty night, the riflemen of the 3rd Battalion, aided by 8-toed 3-inch anti-tank guns from the 876th Tank Destroyer Battalion, clawed at the frozen earth, digging foxholes and building hasty barricades. They knew the SS was coming, and they knew it would come hard. At dawn on December 19th, a thick, ghostly fog settled over the fields and forested slopes. From within that gray shroud emerged the dark shapes of German armor and infantry, paratroopers and SS Panzergrenadiers advancing alongside massive Tiger and Panther tanks. Kampfgruppe, relentless as ever, had arrived. The German guns opened first, their shells tearing through the American lines and sending debris, snow, and bodies flying. Mortar rounds rained down, while machine guns swept across the shattered buildings of Stoumont. Paper's forces moved like a steel avalanche, forcing the weary GIs from one position after another. Despite fierce resistance, the Americans were gradually overwhelmed. Their defensive line crumbled under the combined weight of armor and infantry assault. By mid-morning, the streets of Stoumont echoed with the thunder of German treads. A company of M4 Shermans from the 743rd Tank Battalion raced into the fray, joining the desperate fight in a bid to slow the German advance. The Shermans fired until their barrels glowed, knocking out a few panzers before being forced to fall back. But even their intervention could not stem the tide. By noon, Kampfgruppe had seized control of Stoumont, and the exhausted remnants of the 3rd Battalion were falling back in disarray. General Hobbs received the grim news with a sinking heart. His 119th Infantry Regiment had been driven from its last stronghold in the Amblev Valley, leaving only the understrength 1st Battalion as a reserve. If it too fell, the road to Liège, and ultimately the Allied rear, would lie open to Paper's armored spearhead. Hobbs immediately radioed Colonel Sutherland with a stark order: hold at all costs. But holding the line required more than courage. It required tanks, and the 743rd was now out of ammunition and forced to withdraw to resupply. Desperation pushed Hobbs's staff officers to scatter in all directions, searching for any unit, any tanks, that could be thrown into the path of the advancing SS. One officer found hope in the form of Captain James Redberry and his Company C of the 740th Tank Battalion, stationed near Sprimont. The messenger pleaded with Berry to send his tanks to Stoumont's defense, but the red-headed captain, disciplined and bound by protocol, regretfully refused to move without official orders from higher command. Those orders arrived soon enough. Realizing the dire situation, Hobbs contacted the First Army and requested that the 740th Tank Battalion be attached to his 30th Infantry Division immediately. Approval came swiftly. By 2 p.m., the Daredevils were rumbling forward toward the front lines, an improvised column of mismatched vehicles, untested crews, and iron determination. Company C led the way. As Captain Berry's 14 battered Shermans clattered past the 119th Regiment's command post, the men cheered them on. With a grin and a shout that captured the spirit of the entire battalion, Berry leaned out of his turret and called to a nearby officer, "They're bastard tanks, but we're shooting fools." His words rolled across the cold air like a challenge to fate. Moments later, the Daredevils disappeared down the road toward Stoumont, heading straight into a showdown with some of the most lethal tanks the Third Reich had ever built. The narrow, winding Amblev River Valley presented a formidable obstacle to both sides, its steep forested slopes hemming in the road and rail line that hugged the north bank. On December 19, 1944, the icy fog hung low over the valley, reducing visibility to scarcely 100 yards and transforming every shadow into a potential threat. Along this constricted corridor, the 1st Battalion of the 119th Infantry hunkered down, waiting tensely for the German armored column under Kampfgruppe to appear. By mid-afternoon, the expected SS panzers had yet to materialize, and the chill drizzle made each passing minute feel like an eternity. Recognizing that waiting passively might invite disaster, Lieutenant Colonel Robert H. Herlong, commanding the 1st Battalion, coordinated with Captain James Redberry of the 740th Tank Battalion to take the initiative. They devised a daring spoiling attack, sending Berry's tanks forward to cover the road while Herlong's infantry secured the flanks, their target a small granite block structure known as Stumont Station, barely 800 yards down the road. 3rd Platoon, led by the young and cautious Lieutenant Charles D. Powers, moved first. Powers hugged the cliffside as he advanced, his Sherman's machine guns rattling fire into every possible enemy hiding spot, the crew hyper-aware that their tank was outclassed by any German Panther or Tiger they might encounter. The valley's cold shadows amplified every sound, the snapping of trees, the distant roar of engines, and the echo of gunfire. Their first contact came swiftly. As Powers rounded a curve near Stumont Station, a Panther emerged, camouflaged with brush only 50 yards ahead. Corporal Jack D. Ashby, the gunner, fired a single precise shot that struck the Panther's gun mantle and ricocheted into its driver's compartment, engulfing the German behemoth in flames. The momentum carried the Americans forward, but danger lurked at every turn. Powers's crew soon identified a second Panther. Ashby's next round struck its lower slope, leaving the tank crippled, but just then, Technician 5th Grade Howard Henry reported a jammed gun. Helpless, Powers had to wave forward the next tank to finish off the damaged SS vehicle. That next vehicle was an unfamiliar sight, an M36 tank destroyer manned by Staff Sergeant Charlie W. Loopy and his crew, who had never operated the vehicle before. Despite its light armor, the M36 carried a formidable 90mm cannon. Gunner Corporal William H. Beckman quickly adapted, firing 3 rounds that immolated the second Panther. Powers's loader soon cleared the jam, and his Sherman rejoined the line. Another 150 yards ahead, a third Panther was spotted. Ashby's rounds disabled it completely, securing the road for the Americans. By nightfall, Lieutenant Colonel Herlong halted the attack. In just 30 minutes of intense combat, Berry's ragtag collection of bastard tanks had recaptured Stumont Station. Halting papers advanced down the Amblev Valley. The months of grueling realistic training at Camp Baus had clearly borne fruit, but the 740th's trials were far from over. That first night, encased in the warmth of their metal tanks and the glow of the burning Panthers, the men found little comfort. It was too cold to sleep, one tanker recalled. All we could do was curl up in the tank like dogs. Reinforcements trickled in from the Sprimont depot, along with fuel, ammunition, and radios, as the men prepared to renew the fight at dawn. On the 20th, weather remained miserable. Cold rain and dense fog again limited visibility. 2nd Platoon, led by 1st Lieutenant John E. Calloway, spearheaded the attack, with infantry from the 119th Infantry providing protection on the flanks and artillery and mortars ready to support. The goal was the village of Stumont, 2 miles up the road, where Paper's main force awaited. Calloway's lead tank quickly engaged a Panther, destroying it with an armor-piercing shell that blew its muzzle apart in a fiery display. The platoon then dispatched 2 SS half-tracks but soon encountered a minefield. Staff Sergeant Homer B. Tompkins's M4 Sherman was blown off its tracks, yet he and his crew scrambled to safety under relentless machine gun fire. Even in the face of treacherous terrain, freezing weather and enemy armor superior in firepower, the Daredevils pressed forward, their courage, training, and improvisation keeping the American defense alive in a valley that could have easily become a tomb. The battle for Stumont on December 20th to 21st, 1944, was a brutal testament to the chaos and unpredictability of the Ardennes campaign. That day, American forces had made significant gains, capturing the small hamlet of Targnan and pushing to the outskirts of Stumont before the setting sun. But nightfall brought with it a ferocious resistance from the Waffen-SS. Some American infantry had taken up positions in St. Edouard Sanatorium, a massive brick building perched on a steep hill on the eastern edge of the village. Its commanding location made it a strategic stronghold, Whoever held Saint-Édouard's effectively controlled the surrounding battlefield. Recognizing this, the German SS prepared a night assault to retake it, and around 11 p.m., a force of 50 to 100 fanatical panzergrenadiers, their cries of Heil Hitler echoing through the darkness, stormed the building. The American defenders were driven out, and the Daredevil tankers from the 740th could do nothing. The steep cliffs prevented them from bringing their guns to bear, forcing them to wait until daylight to resume their offensive. At 4 a.m. on December 21st, under a misty dawn, First Lieutenant David Oglensky advanced his M4 Sherman cautiously into the gloom. Technician 4th grade Robert Russo, the driver, later recalled the terrifying scene. All hell broke loose. Hidden German anti-tank guns opened fire, piercing Oglensky's tank and forcing the crew to abandon it. The lieutenant scrambled into the next Sherman, only to be struck by a Panzerfaust rocket, which engulfed the tank in flames. In the span of moments, 2 more M4s were destroyed in similar fashion, 3 of them burning violently along the icy road. With the vehicles obliterated and Saint-Édouard Sanatorium firmly in Paper's hands, the American advance stalled, trapped by the terrain and the ferocity of the German counterattack. Despite appearances, the German situation was far from ideal. Kampfgruppe Paper, though seemingly dominant, was critically hampered by fuel shortages that had already forced the cancellation of his planned drive on Liege. Even now, he was frantically requesting permission to pull back eastward. His failure to capture key bridges and American fuel depots left his armored column immobilized in the valley, precariously positioned in a place that was difficult to defend against determined counterattacks. Ironically, just 2 miles north of Paper's route, almost 1 million gallons of gasoline sat stored in 5-gallon jerry cans along the roadside, guarded by only a modest contingent of Belgian soldiers. Had the Germans discovered and seized this vital resource, the tide of the battle might have shifted dramatically, allowing Paper's armored juggernaut to press on through the Ardennes instead of becoming bogged down in the treacherous Amblev Valley. That night, the collision of determined defenders, unforgiving terrain, and logistical failures illustrated how tenuous even the most fearsome advance could become in the unforgiving winter of 1944. The recapture of Stoumont during the final days of December 1944 was a harrowing and heroic chapter in the Battle of the Bulge, showcasing both ingenuity and sheer grit on the part of the Americans. Task Force Harrison, under Brigadier General William K. Harrison, Jr., now included the 119th Infantry Regiment and the 740th Tank Battalion, the latter better known as the Daredevils. Reinforcements from the 3rd Armored Division pushed into the battle north and east of Stoumont, steadily tightening the noose around Kampfgruppe Paper as the German forces retreated toward their base in L'Église. However, Stoumont itself remained a thorn in the Allied side, held stubbornly by the SS in Saint-Édouard Sanatorium, a massive brick building dominating the eastern edge of the village. Determined to dislodge the enemy, Lieutenant Colonel George Rubel somehow acquired a self-propelled 155mm howitzer and personally began bombarding the sanatorium, hurling 50 high-explosive rounds over open sights into the structure. The Germans inside were stunned but resolute, refusing to surrender under the thunderous artillery fire. Captain James D. Redberry, ever the resourceful tactician, devised a plan to bring tanks up to the seemingly impregnable building. That night, he led Company C through painstaking work, crawling around the sanatorium to find a feasible tank route, building a corduroy track from felled trees and spent shell casings, all while service teams towed away the 4 wrecked tanks from the previous day's fighting under the cover of a thick smokescreen. By daybreak on December 22nd, Berry's efforts bore fruit. A platoon of M4 Sherman tanks was positioned right against Saint-Édouard's, firing through windows to pin the SS inside while soldiers from the 119th Infantry entered and finally recaptured the building. Nearly 250 civilians, many of them children, were discovered in the sanatorium cellar, dazed but unharmed, a testament to the Americans' precision and urgency under fire. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Powers and Staff Sergeant Lupe's teams eliminated 2 more German tanks, one a Panther and the other a captured Sherman, shattering Paper's defensive posture and forcing the remaining SS troops to flee toward L'Église. Coordinated advances from the 2nd Battalion, 119th Infantry, and Combat Command B of the 3rd Armored Division hastened the Germans' retreat, while by nightfall, the U.S. forces had gained 2,000 yards past Stoumont despite fierce resistance. Remarkably, despite the ferocity of the combat, the 740th Tank Battalion suffered no fatalities, although 5 tanks were lost and 6 men wounded. Infantry losses were higher. The 1st Battalion, 119th Infantry, endured 106 casualties, including 18 killed, 60 wounded, and 28 missing. On December 23, Task Force Harrison pressed toward La Gleize but was halted by stubborn German resistance, including relentless fire from Paper's remaining troops and defensive positions. Paper, now huddled in his basement headquarters, faced the grim reality of his 9-day Ardennes campaign: total failure. With fuel, ammunition, and supplies exhausted, he ordered his forces to destroy their equipment and retreat on foot. By Christmas Eve, the remnants of Kampfgruppe Paper had abandoned La Gleize, leaving behind at least 28 heavy tanks, 70 half-tracks, 8 armored cars, and scores of artillery pieces, while suffering over 85% casualties of the original 5,800-man force. Only about 800 exhausted frozen soldiers escaped to German lines. The Daredevils, however, found no rest. On December 29th, they joined forces with the 82nd Airborne Division, operating in extreme cold and under relentless combat conditions, integrating seamlessly with the paratroopers and demonstrating the unit's adaptability and stamina. Once the Battle of the Bulge concluded in January 1945, the 740th Tank Battalion continued its relentless advance across Germany, supporting various infantry divisions and airborne units with few pauses beyond maintenance and resupply. By V-Day, the Daredevils had been at the spearhead of combat for 138 consecutive days, with 43 men killed in action and an astounding 57 tanks lost during their half-year of continuous fighting. Yet their impact was undeniable. They destroyed 69 enemy tanks, including 17 Tigers and Tiger IIs, captured or neutralized hundreds of artillery pieces and combat vehicles, and even destroyed approximately 200 aircraft, most caught on the ground at an airfield in Hagenau. Heroes of the battle, such as Captain Barry, Lieutenant Powers, and Staff Sergeant Lupi, were awarded the Silver Star for their courage at Stoumont, while every member of the 740th Tank Battalion received the Presidential Unit Citation. The men of the 740th had proven themselves under the most extreme conditions, earning accolades but, more importantly, the respect of their peers. As veteran tank commander Cecil Taylor later reflected in 2008, "We were a good outfit. I don't know if it's because we were scared or just didn't have any better sense, but we got the job done." The Battle of Stoumont exemplified the ingenuity, determination, and heroism of the Americans who stood firm against Hitler's elite SS, a decisive action that contributed to the unraveling of Germany's final offensive in the Ardennes.